Right, everybody. Hope everyone's having a great July. We'll just let everyone log in here and we'll start in about a minute.
Pardon me.
Darcy, you look very nice in red. I didn't
Thank
know
you,
it was
sir.
Christmas season already, but I guess so, eh?
My go-to, it's like Tiger Woods on a, not that we see Tiger Woods on a Sunday anymore, but it's his go-to shirt on a Sunday. So it's my
Oh, is
go-to.
it? Okay.
Yeah, he wears red every Sunday when he gets there. So
Nice.
this is a cool webinar. So we have a lot of people, so I figured I'd don the red today.
There you go. I like it. All right. So reminder, you can send questions below in the chat. There's a Q&A button. I'll read the questions. Today, the topic is mediation and termination with Darcy. It's on focus on consulting. And again, he'll be doing like we normally do. He'll be doing about a 15-minute presentation. Then it's an open Q&A. Submit your questions. We'll get to them. And then also Darcy will talk about it too, but we're also doing a summertime promo. We're starting it today until the very last day of August, 25% off consulting. And think of consulting as like a customized project, essentially. That's a bit, not necessarily one of our day-to-day type of offerings that we do. And so it's a great offer. It's a great webinar, and I'm going to pass it over to Darcy. We'll begin. And again, if you have any questions, please do submit them, and we'll get to them in about 15, 20 minutes. Over to you,
Awesome. Thanks, Brett. No, I appreciate the intro as always. Love your shirt as well. That's all I got to say. So no, thanks everybody for coming. We have a great turnout. We had a ton of participants or a ton of registrants, and people are still pouring in, so that's great. For everybody who's been on here before, I have a tendency to talk fast. This will be recorded and sent to everybody who registered. So, and we're going to jump right in because actually the topics we have today are more so, it's almost two topics in one. We try to keep the presentation itself to about 20 minutes max, just so we can have that time for the Q&A, because that's what we're getting the rave reviews about, is that everyone can come ask their questions. Anyone who's in listening gets the benefit of hearing questions that other people are asking. This is what we do every day. So all we do is answer questions and of course consulting. This is our first topic-based presentation in our webinar series. The last one we did, we kind of introduced our top 5 consulting projects that our clients love. Mediation and termination processes is definitely one of them. Obviously, in our membership, we provide advice to our clients, so you can call in anytime, get advice, get templates. We also actually will physically do the terminations for you. We will physically do mediations for you. That's considered, it's an add-on to your membership. It's a consulting project, but a lot of our clients don't know that it's something we do. This webinar today will be about a little bit of knowledge base, and if you have any questions about our consulting products, of course, you can offer that in your Q&A as well. So we're going to jump right in. Mediation, we're going to start with that. So talk a little bit about mediation in general. Again, this is a high-end overview. We're trying to keep it to 15, 20 minutes so we get that time for Q&A. So it's going to seem like we're missing a whole bunch, and we are, but you're going to hopefully get a lot out of it and some key takeaways. So basically, mediation is a way of managing conflict that uses an impartial person. Now, the impartial person doesn't have to be external, although it's advised, but it can be a partial person internal that resolves a dispute between two parties who are having some sort of an issue. This has seen a huge rise in popularity in HR in general, union environment and non-union environment. That there's some caveat to that, but certainly for us at HR Covered, the amount of times we get asked to do mediations over the last year is steadily increasing, simply because it's a more flexible approach. When you think about your other alternatives, you're talking about performance management, you're talking about discipline, you're talking about terminations, all of which are costly, time-consuming, disciplinary in general. This gives you a more flexible approach. Not only that, it's typically a faster approach. A properly done performance management or progressive discipline process can take months, even years, right? With a mediation, it's sit down for a couple of hours, and hopefully, if everything goes well, you're able to hash out your differences and you come out with a less stressful, more meaningful outcome that was formed in agreement and not necessarily out of a putative process. You can use mediation, begging your pardon, at any point during a conflict. But it's really important to know, if you're considering mediation as one of the tools you want to put in your toolbox, it's really important to know when you identify conflict in the workplace, in the office, in the field, wherever it is that your workplace is. Once you start to identify conflict and you realize that it's meaningful and might have some important outcomes, not necessarily in a good way, it's really good to get into this process sooner than later. The more two people get into a process where they're disagreeing, especially if it's not a matter of principle, when they're disagreeing, they're not seeing eye to eye, the more entrenched they become in their positions. They start to build allies in the workplace, which makes for a horrible workplace culture. And it also makes it more difficult for one party to say, hey, mea culpa, I'm wrong, or, oh, I see your point of view, because they're so enshrined. So it's really important to start the process as soon as you see something that you know will have a meaningful outcome and potentially negative, and get into it and get it started early. Well, there's still compromises a little bit easier to reach. Choosing a mediator is a key. The most important thing, obviously, is they must be unbiased. So I put down here that obviously best practice is to use a third party. Again, we do this for our clients often, and at a reasonable rate. Just going to throw that in there. But we do this for our clients often, but you can use an internal source. When you're a small to medium-sized business, which is what most of our clients are, it's definitely more of a challenge because almost everybody is working at arm's length. But, there's always those exceptions to the rules where, for example, if you have a board, for example, or a council, that's not a bad person if they're willing and wanting and skillful enough to do this type of thing. A board or a council person is an excellent, idea of who could be a mediator. A manager who's not a direct report can be a mediator. It's just really important that there's not any type of bias. And again, real or perceived. If it's a real bias, you might as well throw the process out the window because anything you come up with at the end is not going to be seen as valid or legitimate. If it's a perceived bias, just as bad. It doesn't matter what you and I know, it's what we think or see. And that's what other people are looking at too. So it's really important that, you have an unbiased party, both perceived and in reality. And remember this, I do this, just so you know, I do this at the very beginning of every mediation I do personally. I walk in and I discuss the idea of a win-win. That ideally, what I would like to see as a mediator is I would like to see a win-win outcome where both of you walk away happy. Let's make this clear though, a win-win requires compromise. Compromise typically requires a little sacrifice. For example, we just had an LCBO strike. For those people in Ontario, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For you HR people, you definitely know because you need that place. But for anybody outside of Ontario, that is our liquor control board. So we just had a strike there. I can assure you that they're all both happy with the deals right now, but neither one of them is perfectly happy. There was a compromise both parties had to give up. It's no different in a mediation. You have to set people's expectations accordingly. This is something that all parties should know, including the mediator. If the mediator doesn't realize that, your mediator isn't the person for the job, right? If they don't know that that's not just a lesson, that's a truth. If they don't know that coming out of the gate, you don't have the right person for the job. So just give you that out of the gate. So the mediation process, now again, this isn't everything. I know a lot of people that do mediations and they're really good at their job, and some of them do them drastically different than I would do it. It's not a black and white area. It's more of a gray area in a lot of things, but there's certain things that I maintain as a truth. So I'm going to share them with you. And then, it's like I said, you could be a little bit flexible around these things. It's one of the good things about mediations is there is allowing for flexibility and adaptability. But for me, these are things that are important. First and foremost, non-starter, set a plan and ground rules out of the gate. Everybody needs to know that this is a safe place. This is respectful communication, establish communication protocols properly, establish expectations, for example, the win-win scenario and what that means, and then meet with each person separately just to go through and allow them to ask these questions of you about the process specifically, not necessarily about the outcomes. Let them ask you questions about the process so they can understand it, feel comfortable with it. You're already starting to de-escalate and tear down the walls before you put two people together. The last thing you want to do is have two people in crisis, throw them in a room together and say, let's talk about this. Just doesn't work that way. Be honest and transparent and encourage all parties to do so. Worst thing a mediator can do, now don't get me wrong, negotiation skills and being persuasive is a good thing for a mediator, but it's not the most important thing. If the two parties in the room feel like they're being sold, then they're not going to come to a meaningful outcome. And even if they do, it's not going to have a lasting, stay, if you will. So it's important for the mediator to lead by example, be transparent and honest, well, respectful, and create a safe place for these two people or however many people are in the conflict, just so they know that you could say what you need to say, as long as you follow the rules of engagement, which we've already discussed, that you're fine to say whatever it is that you need to do to get this resolved. respectful listening by all parties. So you hear all these things about active listening and all that kind of stuff, and all that's true. For me, it's respectful listening. For like respectful, it's not that far away from active listening. As a mediator, one of the key things you need to do is make sure the two parties, when one is talking to the other or talking to the group, that the other party is actually listening. And a good way to do that every once in a while, if you feel like they're being disengaged or being disrespectful because they're kind of steering elsewhere, is reiterate the questions or the comments that the one party is asking to the other party to bring them back into the conversation and almost force them to say, hey, listen, this is what this person said. Did you hear that? I know you listened, but did you hear what they're saying? Do you understand why they feel so strongly about this? Can you at least appreciate it, right? So that's important. Again, this is something where I have some of my colleagues that do mediation. They will respectfully disagree, and that's fine. Mediate problems, do not necessarily solve them. For me, the best solutions that come from conflict are those reached by the people in conflict, not the third person in the room that thinks they know all the answers. I might know all the answers. I might walk into a mediation and say, I know how this wants to come out. I know ideally how I would like to come this out. But if I walk in there and tell them how it's going to be done or why it's going to be done and it needs to be done, I guarantee you that conflict, that resolution, whatever we come up with in the end, isn't going to have staying power. It's good to offer suggestions, acknowledge good points made by both parties, and encourage compromise, but try to, be the facilitator of a compromise, not the decision maker in a compromise. That's important. And all of these things, by the way, we do train the trainer. So if this is something that within your organization that you want to have a manager or an HR person or what have you that wants to learn how to be a mediator, or at least have some of the skills that come associated with being a good mediator, we do train the trainer. So instead of using us on an ad hoc basis, which you're more than welcome to, we can also work with you to train your management staff this way. When necessary, and this doesn't always happen, but again, conflict management being what it is, try to de-escalate the situation. So whenever you're trying to de-escalate the situation, my favorite thing is, and one thing I say, if I get asked the question, and typically when I do a webinar or seminar on this, I always get asked the question, what skills do you need? Number one for me, or number one or two up there, is empathy. One of the things that causes conflict is when people fail to put each other in other person's shoes. They're not understanding why this person feels this specific way and how it might affect them. So it's really important when you're trying to de-escalate a circumstance that you try to get the one person to see the other person's point of view. That gives them a better idea and understanding of why they're taking the stance they are. Super important. I just did an investigation not that long ago. We walked in with four separate complaints. I walked out with two. I was able effectively, I thought anyways, I'm not trying to be biased, but I thought I was able to effectively get other people to see the position or, kind of account that this other person had. And we were able to resolve that mechanism. We were able to resolve those disputes without the formal harassment part of it. And we were able to move into a mediation, an informal mediation, and get that fixed. That's really important. Empathy in everything HR and leadership is important. But in this case, it's what it is. Create an agreement. After all this is said and done, you went through all this process of this conflict, you brought in a third party, you're sitting down, you worked it all out. Just don't walk away from the table and shake hands. Put it in writing, right? You want something that comes out of conflict can be great, but it can also be temperamental and it can be short-lived. So put it in writing to remind both parties what you agreed on. Talk about moving forward. What is this going to look like? How are we going to work together? How are we going to, do our parts? Do you see any obstacles about implementing this agreement that we just followed? And follow up. Right? Sometimes I'm a big advocate, like as a mediator, I will always follow up with the two people that I mediated with in the company, the client that hired me to do it. But I'll actually encourage the two parties that were in the conflict to follow up with one another and say, you know what, that was a great chat last week. From my end, everything's going well. I just wanted to check in with you, see what's up. There's things about a mediation process for the two people that are in the mediation. There's a lot of leadership skills they can take away if done properly from an effective mediation. So that's the mediation piece. I'm looking at my clock here to see where we are because I can't with my screen up. Oh, all right. We're already 15 minutes in. Okay, so I'm going to go through this quick because I know some of you have been through webinars that I've done on terminations, and we always do at least one a year. And our great HRC law folks do webinars as well, and they always touch on termination at least once a year. So I just took a couple slides, high end about processes for termination. It's not everything, it's far from it. We could talk about this for 2 hours, but it'll give you an idea of what the process for terminations look like. Terminations are not that complicated. Yes, we do them for our clients, but I'm not saying that it's, how do I say this? Yes, we do them for our clients. I'm not dismissing the fact that we do it and it's a good idea to have a third party, but at its nexus, it's the little things that create the liability. Terminations as a process are actually really straightforward. It's as simple as this. It's really 3 steps. Determine whether it's with cause or without. Okay, that's a big step, especially in Ontario, because in Ontario, not only do you have to get cause, and cause basically, I know the term with cause isn't supposed to be in existence anymore, but most people still resonate with it. So I'm continuing to use it for the purpose of our webinars. But when it comes to termination, you have to determine whether or not the whatever that employee did, whether it be one egregious act or a series of acts that culminate into being egregious, is something that breaks the trust. You can no longer work with this person. They can no longer work with you. That's essentially a layperson's definition of cause. In Ontario, you have to reach the bar of willful misconduct, which means not only does the act have to be egregious, it has to be intentional or deliberate. That's almost impossible to prove. It's very difficult to prove. That's why 95% of terminations are without cause. Once you've arrived at that outcome, the only thing you have to do, and it's this simple, the only thing you have to do is determine how much money you're going to pay. Right. So we're going to talk about that on the next slide a little bit, but that's it. You could terminate anybody, and we'll get to the next slide and I'll talk about it. But that's really that's the nexus of basically a termination process. Now, of course, a little bit self-serving, it's something we do. We're always going to recommend that you use an HR professional or an employment lawyer. And if it's not us, that's fine. It doesn't need to be us. As long as you're getting the support and expertise that you need, that's all we care about. We just care about our clients and our prospective clients being taken care of. But certainly, myself doing this for 30 years, my other HR person that's been doing this for over 20 years, we have a lot of experience in this, and we have a team of lawyers as well that can support you if you ever need us to walk in and do the termination for you. So terminations without cause, this is an important slide because we just talked about, 95% of terminations happen without cause. So you have to understand this. And I know there's always questions about this whenever we do a termination webinar, so I won't go into great detail. You can terminate anybody for almost any reason you want in most jurisdictions, not all. And even that, there's still caveats where you could basically get it done, provided you don't break their ESA or human rights, okay? The only thing you have to do is pay them enough money. As long as you pay them enough money, you're fine. So you hear all this time, you say, oh, I've been sued for wrongful dismissal. And people go, oh, what did you do wrong? You must be a really bad employer. That's really unfair. 90% of wrongful dismissal claims have nothing to do with why you terminated them or what you did while you were terminating them. It has to do with you didn't give them enough money. That's all they're disputing. You wrongfully dismissed me because you did not give me enough money. So the first thing you're going to see when you're looking at money is, what do I owe? Termination pay, right? So, and that's for small and medium-sized businesses. Again, the majority of our clients, sometimes this is a wake-up call. It's not a call I enjoy having when you have a client on the line. Yeah, I want to terminate this person. How long have they been there? 8 years, so I owe them 8 weeks, right? I go, no, that's the minimum. That's just the tip of the iceberg. That's difficult for clients to hear for the first time, because all of a sudden that 8 weeks that they made a business decision on and we're about to do this and they're just calling you to get that little bit of advice turns into 8 months. Now we're going to explain why that 8 weeks turns into 8 months. Keep this in mind. In every province except Ontario and Northwest Territories, you do not have to continue benefits via the legislation. The case law, on the other hand, suggests you do. So that's a gray area too, which we have lots of clients call and talk to us about. So every province, with the exception of Quebec, and Quebec kind of has their own version, it's civil, not common law, but every province with the exception of Quebec has common law. Common law is a theory of fairness. It's the theory that person that my client wanted to terminate after they've been there for 8 weeks. And the unit, and keep this in mind, if anybody's listening to any of my webinars, you know this, I'm going to say this, I always say it in every webinar, an employment agreement is a contract. It's a legally binding contract. If you end it, you're breaking it. The consequences fall on you. So the courts say that if you had someone there for 8 years and you took away their employment after 8 years, it's simply giving them 8 weeks notice to find another job. It's not fair, that they're going to need more time to find another job. So they use a bunch of different factors to determine how much time they're going to need, or money in place of time, like to sustain them while they're looking for jobs. Those factors are referred to as the Bardell factors. Basically, primarily, now there's other factors a court can use, and they reserve the right to use what factors they want, but they must always use these ones. And what you're looking at is service time. So their start date, 1 year, it's going to be less expensive to terminate somebody for 1 year than it's going to be to terminate somebody with 10 years. But they're looking at their position, their age, their years of service. Other things that they look at might be, do they have any are they on a leave of absence? Do they have any medical conditions that might make it difficult for them to find alternative employment, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, the theory is this. whenever you're higher up on all those things. So if you're higher in age, if you're higher in position, if you're higher in salary, if you're higher in years of service, it's going to be harder for that person to find alternative employment. In other words, if I walk out of a job, I've been there for a year, I'm in my mid 30s or early 40s, I make 40 grand a year, and I'm a frontline worker. In this economy, I can walk right out the front door, walk right into somebody else's front door and have a job within a week. If I was 60 years old, I made $150,000 a year, and I was a director, just the process to find another job like that takes months. Not to mention that the fact that even though age discrimination is illegal, the courts acknowledge it exists. So someone who is 40 years old with 20 years experience is going to have an easier time getting a job than someone who's 60 years old with 20 years experience, because people are afraid of the costs coming associated with hiring and then having to terminate people at an older age, and they also have them for less time. There's a whole bunch of factors in there, but that's what the Bardell factors are. That's what makes up common law for the courts. Anybody who's watched our employment agreement webinars know this very well, because I'll say the employment agreement is the most important document in the employment engagement world. If you have a well-crafted employment agreement, you can mitigate your damage if not eliminate it, but you got to keep in mind the courts are continually changing case law on whether termination clauses. I just did a great webinar with the commerce folks out in Alberta. Brett and I were both there. It was terrific. And thank you for anybody of you who was on the call. And I explained to them about 2 court cases that came out this past rolling year that basically say these termination clauses, although well written, have a little bit of ambiguity. I mean, a little bit of ambiguity, so they threw the whole thing out. In other words, if you had your termination clause looked at in the last year or two, no matter what jurisdiction you're in, it's likely there's a better than average chance it's void. And I'll skip through this last slide really quick. This is about the termination process, so I want to throw in a little bit of the process. The meeting, be prepared, okay? Don't go in there, don't say, I'm going to fire this person and walk in there. Calm down, go in there, calm and collected, be ready to go, be prepared for any outcomes that you're going to get from this person. So be prepared, have the letter ready. If you can't terminate somebody unless you've given them the letter. So have the letter ready. You could send it to them directly after if you want, if you're doing a virtual, but it has to come to you. You have to speak to the letter and be able to give it to them. Say as little as possible. This is the number one reason. The liability part, sure. The number one reason we get asked to do terminations for our clients is because employers and human beings in general have a very difficult time shutting up when they say you're terminated because you're not a good fit. Yeah, but why? They get upset, they start to cry, they get angry, they ask lots of questions. Do not say a thing. Very difficult thing to do. A lot of employers feel very uncomfortable having to maintain that, and they get themselves into trouble. It's the number one reason they ask us to do it. We're good at it. I guess we're just mean that way. Settling on terms. These are just a couple of important lessons. I know people like to go in, and there's some people out there, some of my clients especially, that like to go in there and negotiate. Just keep this one thing in mind. Whatever you settle at the table with the employee before a court gets involved, before a lawyer gets involved, whatever you agree on at that table will be the best deal you get. Okay. And it's the same thing for the employee potentially as well. But for you, it'll be the best thing you get. If you can avoid legal fees, if you can avoid all of the things that come with court, if you can avoid all the things that would negotiate with the lawyer, the deal you get at that table would be the best thing you get. So go in there and make a reasonable or even generous offer to start. One of the caveats most people are not aware of, if you put a very reasonable or even generous offer on the table, and that employee, for whatever reason, believes that they're entitled to more, had a lawyer whisper honey in their ear saying they're going to get more, et cetera, et cetera. If they take you to court and the court rules that the original offer that the employer made was reasonable and fair, and that's what they're getting, you actually, if you put in a countersuit at the beginning of the court case, you have the right to get you in some cases, you have the right to get all of your legal fees back, because basically the court is ruling that a person that said that package is unfair and took this to court is wasting the court's time. So there's an advantage to being reasonable off the start. It actually puts you in a good position should you end up in a third party. Know your opponent, okay? Whether you're going to negotiate or you're just going to put your best foot forward, a lot of that will have to be based on what is your employee willing to do or capable of. So the willing to do is, are they an angry person? Are they a person that's going to fight back on principle no matter? You give them $1 million, no, I want $1,000,001, let's go to court. So you have to know that before you go in and strategize about what your amount is that you're going to offer. The willing and capable, again, 2 different things. You might have somebody that makes $20 an hour. They're not necessarily going to be, and I know this sounds cruel, but this is HR and it's what it is. they might not necessarily be able to go out and spend $5,000 on a retainer for a lawyer. So that's something in the leverage, which terminations are. It's a negotiation, it's leverage. That's something you have to be aware of. You have to know where your employer is and their financial viability. Always, if you are giving more money than what is required, and it still happens, and I don't understand why this happens, but it's frustrating. You always get a full and final release. I don't care if you give them the ESA plus a bowl of cornflakes. For that, if you want those cornflakes, you must sign this full and final release. If they get anything more than the minimum, you want a release securing you from liability so you can go to bed at night and say that's over. Okay. And I still have clients that don't do that because they say, oh, I don't want to make it too legal. And then 2 weeks later, 2 months later, they get sued. And they say, well, we were being generous. I go, doesn't matter. You paid them what you were willing to pay them. Now they're coming back for more. You don't have a release they have the right to do that. And this is super important. You must give your employee time to review the agreement. You just can't say, here's your termination. You have 2 hours or you have 2 minutes before you walk away from here. You have to sign this release or we're taking off the table. It's a legal document you're putting in front of them. They need at least 5 business days. Okay. And if they ask for more time, depending on the circumstances, you typically grant it. So that's it. I know that's super high end. This is what we do before we hit the Q&A. Anybody who's seen this slide before, we do everything. Like we literally do everything. The compliance, the health and safety, the employee life cycle, and the HR strategy, that's our membership. When you buy a membership with us, you get all of that. But these are the other things we do to fill in the gap. Now, obviously, this is a consulting webinar, and you're getting 25% off if you call today or in between the end of summer, August 30th. Anything that's not in our membership is consulting. We can do that. We have a recruitment department, and we have the only HRC laws, or as a company, the only legal department, a bunch of lawyers are their own entity, but they're partners with us. They're the only lawyer, whatever firm that offers unlimited HR. You pay, very similar to a membership. You pay a price, you get unlimited legal advice. So between our HR and our law, we have our clients covered, hence HR covered. That's it. Thank you. Get some water.
Glass of water, Darcy. Nice job. So the main takeaway is make sure they sign a release.
Amongst other things, yeah. But yeah, no, at the end of the day, I'll go into mediations even when this is a bit unorthodox. When I do a mediation, there'll be times when I get them to sign certain documents around confidentiality, and NDAs and all that kind of stuff. So like whenever you do anything that, is over and above, you should always make sure you're getting something back in return.
For sure. Okay, let's jump into it. Lots of questions here. Number one, what are the best practices when conducting a termination meeting?
Okay. We talked about that a little bit in the webinar, but basically you have to appreciate this one thing. When you go into that termination meeting, you're going to get a lot of emotions. I've been in termination meetings where they just said, okay, thanks, bye. They just want anything to do with it. They walk out. That's great. That's awesome. I've also been in termination meetings where I've been punched in the face. I've had termination meetings when I've left twice. I've been in termination meetings when I've left the actual building. There's been a screwdriver through my window or my window's been smashed. So you're going to get a lot. You have to be prepared for the sake that you could get that. And the most important thing you can do in a termination meeting is make sure that you don't overreact or react in kind. And of course, like I said in the webinar, say nothing. If you're terminating for cause, you have the right to do so as long as you pay them. You do not have to give them a reason more than that. The reason can only get you into hot water. Trust me. Made that mistake before in my lifetime too.
In the case of mediation, what are the potential outcomes if the employees who are going through the process just can't work things out?
That's a good question because we actually do get that a fair bit whenever we do mediation work. Typically, there's a process that you would engage in if mediation wasn't an option, or if the two parties didn't want to participate in the mediation, and that could be a progressive discipline process. There's other more formal, rigid processes that people would be subject to. That if a mediation did not work out, that's likely where you're going to fall back into. And typically, if you could get somebody to agree to a mediation, so they're going in with eyes wide open and with an ability or want to compromise. The concept that, if we can't get this worked out in this process, this is the process we're falling back to. That's somewhat of a deterrent or even encouragement, rather, depending on which way you look at it. That's a good encouragement for them to keep on staying the course. And a mediator should be able to leverage that appropriately without threatening them, but saying, you know what, we entered it, like remind them of the reasons you entered into this process, try and, bring back, recreate the need, recreate the cooperation that came out of the gate. But yeah, if it doesn't work out, you fall back on the formal processes. That would be the alternative to mediation, which again, far more rigid, takes a lot longer, not necessarily good outcomes.
Is there a benefit to offering the minimum and then negotiating after with regards to a severance package?
If you want to get sued. Like I get it. It's just you put like the one thing you want to do, and I'm at a call with a client this morning, and they might be attending, but I had a call with this client and said the one thing you want to do when you're doing a negotiation with an employee is try to keep the lawyer out of the room, right? Lawyers are great. Like, don't get me wrong, lawyers have their purpose and everybody has the right to see a lawyer, but ideally, lawyers drive up the prices. They just do. That's their job in part. They're out to get more, they need to get paid themselves. So you want to keep the lawyer out of the room. When you offer just the minimum, the odds of that lawyer coming, like the odds of the person you're hearing back from is not the employee saying, you know what, thank you for the generous offer. I was hoping that you could add on 2 more weeks. When you offer just the minimum, the person you're going to be hearing back from is this 5-page letter that costs the employee $5,000 saying, here's all the case law. This is what we want. Your offer was unreasonable, untenable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like I said, if you do end up in a court, the court will not look on you favorably. If you offer, especially if it's a mid to longer term employee or employee that has barred health factors, the court will have a bias against you. Human nature is what it is. They will have a bias against you, almost likely that, you know, you didn't act like it's not, it's a labor relations thing, but for the term we're using here, did a bargain in back good faith. Like you didn't put your best foot forward. It was so, yeah, I don't recommend it.
Are mediations legally binding?
No, by themselves. You can make them, both parties can agree to make them legally binding. And you know, I know that I've done mediation in union settings where we've come to agreements, because there's a fine line between a mediation and arbitration, but it's actually a completely different thing, but it's the same kind of concept. But yeah, two parties can agree to make the findings or kind of the outcomes going mutually binding, but it kind of defeats the process of a true mediation, because mediation is supposed to be a stress-free environment. It's supposed to be a compromise. And when two parties feel like whatever they agree on, they're stuck with, it makes it doesn't necessarily change the outcome, but it does change the ability to get to said outcome, if you will.
Okay, we have an employee on maternity leave who we were planning on firing anyways, and we have a great replacement. If we're offering to pay a generous package, can we get rid of the person?
Well, one, whether it be the ESA or the ESC, if the job is there and they're entitled to their job back or the next comparable job if it's not there. So you could face a claim under the Employment Standards Act and the Employment Standards Code. The generous package thing, I get it, because at the end of the day, money speaks for all things. If the
Yeah.
employee wants to forgo all of those things, their protections under the ESA or the ESA and the Human Rights Code, they can take a generous package and call it a day. So technically it's doable. It's just the human rights aspect of it. You're basically, it could be argued that you're discriminating against an employee because they went on a maternity leave and now you're replacing them. Human rights is expensive because it's not only the money that they get to have another job like it would be in common law, there's also damages that could come on the table. If you actually follow the human rights process right to the end and you lose, you will get published. So your name will be out there and do serious reputational harm to your organization. So I never encourage terminating somebody on maternity leave to bring somebody else in. If you're going to offer a super generous package, that mitigates your liability, but keep it in mind, the liability does not go away.
So just off that, if you offer them, say, hey, we'll pay you 10 months, sign this release, are you in the clear though?
If the release is written properly, because a release, if it's written properly, will say we forgo you against any claims that you believe you have at this time, right? Because I've had the Ministry of Labor argue with me about this, and it's like, come on, like it's not, it doesn't say that the employer violated their rights. They may very well have violated their rights. It's that the employee doesn't believe at the time of termination that their rights have been violated or acknowledge that they might have been foregone, and they're willing to overlook it for the money. That's what a good release written properly should do. So, and it should say in that release that you forgo any right to, pursue any human rights claims, you forgo any rights to pursue anything under the Employment Standards Act or Code, respectively. So yes, if you get the release signed, you should be fine. In most
We had
cases.
a manager who got, sorry, we had a manager who got in an argument with an employee last week and they have not shown up to work since. Can we assume they resigned?
No, you can't assume, no matter how many people tell you this, and there's a certain truth to it about assuming resignation, but unless there's a clear intent and indication that someone's resigned, in other words, they come up and tell you that they've resigned, they haven't resigned. You could terminate them, and you probably could even terminate them with cause at some point. You would have to reach out to them and say, hey, what's going on? Are you coming back to work? Can you give us, and if they just ghost you and you reached out to them a few times, there's a job abandonment process for that. I'm not going to go into it, but then yes, you could terminate with cause. But you need to understand in this example in particular, your manager argued with an employee. There's a very good possibility that if you assume this person resigned, which you can't do anyways, but some people will do it anyways, or you terminated this person, you might be getting a call for a lawyer saying they were forced to leave because of the issue they have with the manager, which they might characterize as a toxic workplace. They might characterize it as harassment, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever you have a situation like that, you shouldn't cut the employee off or out. You should figure out what the problem was that caused it in the first place. And then if you need to terminate the employee, you can do so. But you have to at least make like for your protection, at least make an opportunity to see what it was that was the nexus of that person leaving the workplace and not coming back.
If we're going to conduct a mediation internally, what qualities or skills should we be looking for in a manager who we're going to pick to do this?
That's a good question because I spoke to that a little bit earlier. Like I know I kind of fluffed off negotiation skills, but negotiation skills are important, like because it gives you the opportunity to recognize, signals and gives you the opportunity. Like if you're a good negotiator and somebody on the other table someone on the other side of the table says something that kind of shows a sign of weakness or shows an opportunity, you're trained on how to pick that up, or you're skilled at least at this to pick it up. The number one thing obviously is impartiality. Being able to, impart judgment, being able to be unbiased, that's critical. Some of that is a skill, some of it's just a position, right? You have to be a person that is technically impartial. Like you can't be engaged in the business or any type of that conflict. But still, critical thinking is not by itself is not something that just people have. Active listening for sure, empathy I mentioned, and good communication skills. Like all of these things, there's probably a list of things that you could put in there for, what would be a good mediator, but certainly at the top, critical thinking, open judgment, empathy, those types of things for me are super important. Active listening too, of course.
What do you do if the one party doesn't want to participate in mediation?
It's kind of almost the same question as, what happens when it doesn't work out. So in a case like that, it's like if one party doesn't want to participate in the mediation, there's no point in actually forcing them to do so. Like the employer has a lot of power and you can direct your employees to do what they want to do. But at the end of the day, if you force them to do it, you're not going to have a good outcome. As a matter of fact, the whole process would be a sham, right? So it's really just reminding that person again what the alternative processes are. So if the one person doesn't want to participate in a mediation, it would be reminding that person, okay, these are the alternative processes. This is where we're going down. Are you fine with that? Because we're offering to help. You know what I mean? And sometimes bringing them, getting them, there's other aspects you can do. Like for me, I've had this happen once recently, and we ended up having the mediation. And really what it was is I got on the phone with the employee and I said, let me try to understand your reservations about the mediation. First, let me explain this to you. Let me explain what the mediation is about. Let me explain what the process is. Let me explain why, it could be helpful and what the outcomes might be and why that might be helpful. And now you tell me, what is your reservation about, what is your reservation about mediation, and try to understand what it is that is holding them back from jumping in and engaging. A lot of times in that case, it was successful. It hasn't always been successful for me. But the last time I had to deal with a circumstance like that, we did get to the mediation table and we did come out to a good outcome. So it was good on that person to have that open-mindedness and to actually jump in and engage.
We have an employee who's on probation. They're also not performing well. They just gave us a medical note to go off on sick leave, but we are planning on terminating them. Can we do it?
You can, but it goes back to the human rights thing. Like I would never personally, I never terminate somebody on sick leave. I think it's folly. It's they're on a leave that's is considered whenever someone goes on a sick leave, even if it's for 5 days, that's considered a disability under the Human Rights Code. So you in my what do you call it? The webinar, I said that you could terminate somebody for any reason, as long as you pay them enough. And in this case, you wouldn't have to pay them because they're in the probation period, unless you violate their ESA, ESC rights or their human rights. And in a case like this, you would likely be violating their human rights. So I would urge that company to get them back, like get the appropriate medical to get them back to work through the probation period till its fullest, try to get the employee to improve, make them aware where they're not improving, so you can have a case against a potential human rights claim should you terminate later in the probation period.
What's the difference between arbitration and mediation?
Arbitration is typically a labor relations thing, so it's typically in a unionized environment. That is, you can have binding arbitration, you can have non-binding arbitration, which you very rarely see because it's very expensive. But an arbitration is more so where you have one party and then they have an argument, you have another party and they have an argument. You're not really trying, you might try to negotiate, but typically what ends up happening is they're making their argument, they're having their argument, and there's an impartial third party who's going to make a decision. Depending on the type of arbitration, the decision could be a compromise, which often happens in union. Like I don't want to burn any bridges here, but I used to be a chief negotiator like for 10 years, and one of the unions I negotiated with was ONA. ONA, like you sat down at the first time, you haven't even started negotiating yet, you put down their intention to go to ARB right away, because they know that the arbitrator is going to pick the middle. But some arbitrators, either by choice or by agreement, say it's one side or the other. We either give you this, we take these people's arguments or these people's arguments. So it can be like it's definitely restricting. It's way more restricting. It is not necessarily a compromise process all the times. Whereas mediation is very much about compromise, active listening, talking it out. Let's see if we can come to a deal. And the arbitrator is the decision maker, where the mediator should simply be the facilitator of that deal between the two parties. The last point for me is the biggest difference.
All right, we got 19 minutes left and only 31 questions to go. And I'll try to skip any ones that are redundant.
I'll try and answer quickly.
Okay. If we have I think you've done something like this. Employee terminated within the probationary period. Is there severance recommended if you fire them within the probationary period?
If you don't have the probationary term in like the actual a clause in your contract saying that you can terminate within the probationary period, I recommend it at that point, because it should have been in your employment agreement. Even though it's into the ESA or ESC, it should have been in your employment agreement. The benefit of offering severance, regardless of whether you owe them money or not, is because you get that release. If at all you're worried about this person coming back, you would all, even if it's a completely fictitious claim, getting that release means a lot. It might be worth a week of pay just to get that release signed so you can go to bed at night and not have to worry about it.
What is your recommended time frame on mediation? We struggle to address issues in a timely manner with heavy workloads, etc. When has the time passed and you should let it go and try to mediate earlier next time versus go back to something that happened a long time ago?
Yeah, like typically for me, and this is going to be a little bit different. Like I know there's a couple of my colleagues on here that are mediators themselves, so they might differ on this answer. For me, it has to be an active, it should be an active issue in the workplace, right? If you know, like judging on that comment, if you know this is going to get restoked again, to me, that's active. That is a great time to do mediation, is when, they've kind of let it slide a little bit. It's going to come back. That it's an issue of just a spark plug. The fact that it's let slide a little bit and you're not in the heat of it all, that's a great time to jump in and say, listen, I know we had this issue a few months back and we're concerned that it might happen again because we have this coming up at the end of the month. Let's talk about it now. Let's get ahead of it, right? So for me, that's what, if something is gone, like it was a conflict, the conflict is gone because human nature being what it is, some people just forget, some people stop caring, and it's not an issue or a foreseeable issue that could pop back up. Yeah, wait till next time and then start again. But if there's a possibility it's going to pop back up again, jump in and get it done. While tempers and personalities are a little bit lower key, you might have more success that way.
An employee has taken holidays and told someone at work that he is applying for work at another company and he'll let us know when he'll be back. We would like to let him know that he does not need to come back. Are we allowed to do that? I guess you just have to fire without cause.
Exactly. That's exactly it. A person has a right to look for alternative employment, especially in Ontario. That's like pretty much a law now. So they have the right to look for alternative employment. If they're on vacation, which is their own time, they absolutely have the right. You have the right to maintain how much vacation time they get. So you could say after your vacation time is back, you're coming back. And if you don't, but yeah, you did the short and simple answer. You could terminate without cause. It's not a situation where because they're looking for other employment and they might not come back, you don't have to pay them. You still have to pay them.
Yeah. When you say continue employment terms, is that health and dental and long-term care and or life insurance? I'm in Ontario and my employer said benefit carriers will not continue benefits beyond ESA.
Right. So that's actually a really good question. And by the way, they're right. Most benefit providers will not continue so there's two types of notice. There's the ESA or ESC notice, which is your statutory working notice. So for the period of time in Ontario, for the period of time that is your statutory working notice or pay in lieu of notice, it's as if you were working. Everything that you were entitled to while you were working, for the most part, you continue to get during that point. After the ESA, the statutory notice, is over, you're not legally entitled to get benefits any longer. Companies can offer it. They can go and ask for permission from the benefit company. So it is a negotiation tool for both sides to actually throw that in, but the benefit company has to allow it. Typically, they will not extend, however, short-term, long-term, or life insurance. That's just a non-starter. So, but it's super important for you employers out there that if you say that benefits are going to be extended for the notice period, and you didn't say for the statutory notice period, you didn't add that little part, then the case law is clear. They will get it for the entire duration of the notice period. And if the benefit company doesn't cover it, then you're going to have to pay the equivalent of a benefit plan to that employee.
You state that providing a reason for without cause termination only raises the liability for the employer. Is this the case when it is due to the abolish of the position? I guess if they get rid of the position, I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, and that's a good point. And that might be one of those circumstances, as long as you truly to goodness, as long as that position has become redundant, it's gone, you're not replacing it with anybody else, anything of that nature. In a case like that, it's operational, and it's operational and factual, and it's that it's operational and factual. Just say that. So you could actually use that as a fact and say, yes, your position has become redundant, or we are eliminating your position. As long as that is actually true, you're fine. If at all, like, it's not true, you might fill the position 2 months later or 3 months later. It just happens that way, which is why I still don't encourage it. And you filled it 2 months later and they're still in their notice period, then they're going to say, okay, you in fact didn't eliminate my position. Now, again, if they signed a release, it doesn't really matter for the most part. But yeah, if in a case like that where you have a factual reason, it's not a matter of judgment or performance or attendance or discipline or anything of that nature, then sure, you can provide that as a reason for the termination.
In Ontario, if someone is terminated with cause, will they be entitled to any lieu of notice?
With cause?
With cause.
Yeah, it depends. So I know that sounds awful, but again, in Ontario, there's two different bars. So there's with cause, and then there's willful misconduct. Okay, so under the with cause is the common law aspect of it. So if you terminated somebody, say someone was entitled to a month statutory notice, you reach the bar, you know that you would satisfy in a court the bar of just cause, no common law would be owed. But if you didn't reach the bar of willful misconduct, which is the act has to be egregious or a series of acts that culminate into being egregious, and it has to be intentional and or deliberate. If you didn't reach that bar, then they're still owed termination pay under the ESA. So you're starting to see a lot more employment contracts say we can terminate you with cause or without notice. We will provide the basic, I'm not going to use the exact wording, but we will provide you with the ESA minimum, but you're not entitled to common law. They're forgoing the fight. They'll say the most we have to pay is 8 weeks. We're fine with that if we want to let you go with cause. It's a little, it's a little bit, that part of it's a little bit complicated, but that is the case law from, I think it's Wakefield, I want to say. Get my case law mixed up. Anyways.
What is the average time in months for people going to court if they decide not to take what the employer has offered as severance?
Yeah, typically it happens pretty quick. So like, typically employees aren't sitting out there with, a bunch of cash that they can, bankroll and go on vacations and all that kind of stuff. And typically the reasons people go to court is, one, because the employer either treated them so unfairly, which is very not common, but it does happen. Or two, the employee, for lack of better HR terms, is pissed off. So that stage where they're angry, that's the time when you're likely going to see them go to a lawyer, push the play. A lawyer is never going to want this to be less than anything but fresh. They're going to want to be new. They're going to be current. So they're going to push the play. So you can expect that you'll end up in court within a couple of months max.
And get a letter like really quick.
You get a letter really quick. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's when we got back to that earlier question about just offering the minimum. You want to get a letter really quick, be unreasonable with your offer.
I was advised to use a severance calculator to determine what they would be owed. Is this true? Do you recommend any? I guess it depends on where you're located and what the calculator is, but
I
are there such things?
I do not like severance calculators. If there's any employment lawyers on there, I apologize in advance. We're going to differ on this 100%. Do not care. I think employment lawyers are there, or calculators are there to be careful, to be safe, to provide, to scare the employer a little bit, and also encourage the employee a little bit, depending on whether it's an employer rep and their calculator or an employee rep and their calculator. So I think every circumstance has certain factors which would dictate where you're going to come in. And it takes away the negotiation, if you will. It's no different when I say know your opponent. When I'm sitting down, I can have the exact same age, exact same position, exact same salary, exact same, and I could say, give this person a month to give that person 6 weeks. And the reason being is I know this person's not a hothead and this person is. And that's, so I don't like to take the nuance away from it. And I think termination calculators are built to be as perfectly careful as possible. Pay the highest amount. That way, if you use a termination calculator and it works out poorly, that you can't sue them. Like, it's, for me, it's just, I'm not a fan. Let's just say that. Sorry, passionate about that one.
Okay, so speaking in the same realm, if we offer over the minimum, but everything over the minimum is conditional on the signing of a full and final release, can what's offered above the minimum be considered if they make a claim to wrongful dismissal, for not getting enough money?
Yep. So here, in a lot of cases, because you got to remember, the employee has an obligation to mitigate their damages. So let's say you you owe somebody a month, you offer them 2 months, and then they go to court, and depending on what the factors are, and that they ended up getting 6 months. The court could rule, because, especially if it's working notice, if it's working notices, is a slam dunk. But the court could rule, because you turned that down, that was there for you. You still could have fought, and you know what I mean, but took the working notice. So they could argue that that does mitigate your working. It's a case by case basis. Again, it doesn't always happen that way. But certainly, if you were offered a certain amount of notice and you turned it down, you went to court and the court ruled that the notice in advance was reasonable, then a court could rule that you owe nothing because they offered that to you, you turned it down, you went for more, you lost.
Can you comment on the pros and cons of the approach of giving an employee a very long notice period if an employer can't afford to give them a large lump sum termination payment?
There's very, like, as far as pros go, there's a lot. You're getting value for your money, right? So if you offered someone, like, and we talk about this when we know that I have clients that know that they're going to have to pay an employee 2 years. That's what the case law dictates. They've been there for 20 years. They're in their late 50s, whatever. They're going to have to pay 2 years. That's where it's likely going to fly. So we've talked about combinations of working notices and payout. And then we've talked about just, giving the 2-3 years of working notices. You're getting value for your money. It's a plus. The negatives are obvious, though. And that's why I seldom recommend it. There's cases where it works, cases where it doesn't. That employee is obviously fired. They're an unhappy employee, right? They can cause a lot of damage within your company as far as company culture. They can cause reputational damage with your clients. They can make intentional or unintentional errors in the workplace that could cost you more money than you would ever even have to pay them out. So there's a time and a place where working notice works. And again, that has a lot to know about knowing your opponent as well. Some people, you will know that if you explain to them your issue and the reason you have to terminate, we don't have the money. We'd like to provide you with this working notice. If you need to go for a job interview or something, feel free to leave. We'll give you a glowing endorsement. And those are the people that okay, they'll play ball with me. They understand where I'm coming from. Other people will just be angry. And if you're going to give them working notice, you'll do more damage than good.
6 minutes, 22 questions still. So if you're terminating multiple people, the business is going through a downturn. I have to assume that different employees will discuss severance packages with each other. So isn't there a risk to negotiate with one person because the rest of the people will find out and they will all ask for the same?
That's pay transparent. Like, it's a version of pay transparency. It's not pay transparency, but employees are entitled to discuss that information. And yes, there's always a risk. Negotiating with a whole bunch of people at once is inappropriate. This is terminations, employment agreements, and terminations. These are confidential matters or personnel matters. So unless you're in a position of a group termination, you reach that threshold under the Employment Standards Act or code, or you're in a union environment in certain cases, whatever. But if you're terminating like 30 people or 20 people, which is under the threshold for group termination, you have to negotiate with each one individually. And yes, you're going to get that. I've done it for friends and family where I've said, listen, I know this other person is, just don't even ask, but I know this other person is asking for this much. Once they settle their deal, you're going to be in a better position. It's part of doing business. It's a difficult thing with having to terminate more than one person at the same time.
At what point in time would it be possible to lay someone off after they have come back from short-term disability or maternity leave to avoid any human rights issues?
Okay, so if it's a legit layoff, like if it's a legit lack of work, and you're laying off more than one person, that always mitigates your damage. But my issue with the question, and forgive me, whoever asked the question, if I'm reading into it, and I apologize in advance, but my issue with the question, the way it was written and read, was it sounds like they're planning the layoff, right? Which means is that you're trying to, now keep this in mind, a layoff, there's no such thing as a permanent layoff. It's a temporary layoff, which means you have a lack of work. You intend on bringing them back after 13 weeks. If you're talking about termination, that's different. There's no clear-cut answer about how long that time period is between they come back and they don't. The more time you give yourself, the more time you mitigate. So if you terminate after a month, you have liability. If you terminate after 3 months, you have less liability. I've had people say that they want to, after 6 months, they're wanting to terminate now. And I said, you still have some, like you can't skate the liability, but certainly the longer you go from it, the better. I would never recommend less than 3 months, ever.
Okay, good to know. Regarding the full and final release, is it common to provide it to the employee being terminated and allow them to return it after they review it? Or do you have them sign it right away in the meeting?
You never have them sign it right away. It's pretty, all they have to do is make the argument and be void. So I had a,
Yeah.
I had a great conversation with a client today who's unfortunately going through this process. I said, even if they sign it in the meeting and slip it across to you, slip it right back to them and say, at least take a day to think about it, have a sober second thought. Do not accept it, because all they have to do is turn around and say, I made an emotional decision at an emotional time, and I didn't mean it. And any judge in the land will say it's void.
So question then, if you did do that and they signed it that day and then they go to a lawyer and say, well, I signed it, I was really emotional, what type of risk do you put yourself at? Is it the same as not having a release, or is it actually worse?
Yeah, it's an awesome question. I guess I don't remember being asked that question quite before, because it's a cool scenario. I would argue it's the same as having a release, unless there was pressure. If the employer put pressure on the employee to sign the release that day, then that lawyer is going to come back and say, you put my client under duress. And that's, that is the manner in which you terminate somebody matters. When you terminate, if you walk them out the door with 2 people on each side of them and you go to court, the person's going to get paid more because you embarrass them. It's not needed. If you put somebody under duress to sign a full and final release, and then they go see a lawyer, it's going to cost you more. But if it was just simply a decision where the employee uniquely, genuinely was emotional and said, I just want to get this over with and signed it, sober second thought, 2 days later, goes and sees a lawyer, and is honest with the lawyer, it'll probably be the same circumstance. But very rarely do employees sign a release same day without the employer putting just a tad bit of pressure on them. Even a suggestion that this deal might not be around all that long. Or if you have a really short period of time, you should never provide less than 5 business days for them to sign it. If you had 2 business days on there, that could be a problem for you.
And this is a question, sounds like from a client, they're just asking about clarification on termination if they are using our subscription. So say they've bought unlimited HR. To my understanding, Darcy, we advise them on how to terminate. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Like our service is designed as such that we're your rep, we're your management rep. So we deal with management. We will do documents for you. We will get you a termination letter. We'll provide you with the release. We'll give you all the advice you need about the termination, what that would look like, how much it might cost. Even if you want some advice about what you should do in the termination meeting, we will happily provide that. What we don't do is deal with the lawyers or the employees and anything, but we can. And that's the consulting arm of it. It's like we have most of our clients will take the advice and they're good to do everything themselves. we have a handful of clients, and it's growing every day, that are worried about the liability or feel uncomfortable sitting down with someone and saying you're fired. So that's when they call us, we say, we will do that for you. This is what it costs. And because you're already a member, it's a pretty decent rate.
All right. Well, thanks, Darcy, to everyone who attended. This has been recorded. It will be sent out on Monday. Actually, might be sent out before. Normally, we do our webinars on Thursday. We had to reschedule. Be sent out before the end of the week. Again, if you want to take advantage of the consulting promo, 25% off before the end of August, all you gotta do is reply to the email, get something set up to talk to us. That was really insightful. Thanks for everything, Darce. And I guess that's it until our next one.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everyone.
All
See you,
right, take
Brett.
care. Bye.